The sun hung like a furnace in the vast Arizona sky, baking the desert into a patchwork of cracked earth and parched sagebrush. Devil's Fork was a town forgotten by most, its wooden buildings standing crooked and faded against the relentless wind. It was the kind of place where men drifted in search of anonymity, and those who stayed lived on the edge of despair, clinging to the meager scraps the desert allowed. On a day when the wind carried the tang of dust and drought, the town's quiet was broken by the sound of hoofbeats. A lone rider emerged from the shimmering horizon, his black horse cutting a sleek, ghostly figure against the endless expanse of sand. The rider's wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but his presence was impossible to ignore. He moved with the deliberate ease of a man accustomed to violence, and as he rode into Devil's Fork, the few townsfolk on the streets gave him a wide berth. The rider slowed as he reached the center of town, his eyes scanning the scene with the detached caution of someone who'd seen trouble in every form. The streets were nearly empty, save for a few children playing in the dust and an old man dozing in a rocking chair outside the general store. A stray dog slunk past, its ribs showing through its matted fur. Life in Devil's Fork was slow and hard, and the arrival of a stranger was enough to set tongues wagging behind closed doors. A quiet entrance. The rider dismounted in front of the saloon, the weathered leather of his saddle creaking under his weight. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his coat and boots coated in the fine layer of dust that spoke of long days on the trail. He tied his horse to the hitching post and gave the animal a gentle pat on the neck. "You've earned your rest," he murmured, his voice low and rough. The boy working at the livery watched from the shade of a nearby awning, his eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. The rider reached into his pocket, pulling out a silver coin which he flipped toward the boy. "Take care of her," he said. It wasn't a request. The boy caught the coin and nodded quickly, leading the black horse away. The rider adjusted his hat, stepped onto the creaking wooden sidewalk, and pushed through the saloon doors. The saloon. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the low murmur of conversation. The smell of cheap whiskey and stale sweat mingled with the faint tang of cigar smoke. A handful of men sat at scattered tables, nursing drinks or playing cards. They glanced up as the stranger entered, their conversations faltering. The room seemed to tense, as if holding its breath. The bartender, a wiry man with a handlebar mustache, stood behind the counter, polishing a glass that hadn't been clean in years. He watched the rider approach, his hands stilling as the man set his hat on the bar. "Whiskey," the stranger said, his tone calm but firm. The bartender poured a measure from a dusty bottle, sliding the glass across the counter. The stranger picked it up, studying the amber liquid for a moment before taking a slow sip. He set the glass down with deliberate care, his eyes scanning the room. "What brings you to Devil's Fork?" a voice drawled from one of the tables. The speaker was a wiry man with a patchy beard and eyes that gleamed like a predator's. He lounged in his chair, one hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. The men at his table smirked, clearly enjoying the prospect of confrontation. The stranger didn't answer immediately. He took another sip of his whiskey, his gaze locking onto the man with a calm intensity that made the smirks falter. "Looking for someone," he said finally. "Who's that?" the man pressed, his voice carrying a hint of challenge. The stranger's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, like the first whisper of a coming storm. "Eli Granger." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. The tension that had been simmering suddenly boiled over. Men shifted in their chairs and hands inched toward holstered guns. Eli Granger wasn't just a name, he was a legend, a ghost whose reputation was written in blood. Leader of the Granger gang, he was known for leaving no witnesses and no survivors. That someone would ride into Devil's Fork looking for him was unthinkable. "You got a death wish, stranger?" the wiry man asked, leaning forward. "Granger don't take kindly to being hunted." The stranger met his gaze without flinching. Maybe it's time someone hunted him. A nervous chuckle rippled through the room, but it didn't last. The man at the table pushed back his chair, standing slowly. "You don't know what you're getting into." The stranger's hand moved to his side, resting lightly on the worn grip of his revolver. "Maybe you don't either." The room went silent, the air heavy with the promise of violence. But before the tension could snap, the bartender cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "Take it outside if you're gonna shoot," he said, his voice tight. "I just got these tables fixed." The wiry man hesitated, his bravado faltering under the stranger's unyielding gaze. Finally, he sneered and sat back down, muttering under his breath. The stranger turned back to the bar, finishing his whiskey in one smooth motion. A warning. As the stranger stepped out of the saloon, the wind kicked up, swirling dust around his boots. He paused on the sidewalk, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the town. Behind him, the bartender leaned against the doorway, his expression wary. "You're a damn fool if you're really looking for Granger," the bartender said. "That man's more dangerous than a rattlesnake with its tail stepped on." The stranger adjusted his hat, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then it's a good thing I'm not scared of snakes." The bartender shook his head. "Suit yourself, but you'd better watch your back. Granger's got eyes everywhere." The stranger didn't respond. He stepped off the sidewalk and strode toward the livery, his boots crunching against the dry earth. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the street. As he reached his horse, he paused, running a hand along its neck. "Soon," he murmured. "It ends soon." The people of Devil's Fork watched from their windows as the stranger rode out of town, the fading light turning him into little more than a silhouette against the desert sky. Whispers spread like wildfire, speculation about who he was and why he would dare seek out Eli Granger. For the stranger, though, there was no mystery. His name was Isaac Cole, and he wasn't just looking for Granger, he was coming for him. And in Devil's Fork, death was rarely far behind. The desert sprawled endlessly in every direction, its vast emptiness punctuated only by jagged rock formations and clusters of scraggly sagebrush. The sun hung high in the sky, unyielding and brutal, as Isaac Cole rode deeper into the wilderness. Each creak of the saddle and rhythmic crunch of his horse's hooves blended into the ambient hum of the desert, a place where the living and the dead seemed separated by the thinnest of veils. Isaac had always preferred the quiet. It gave him time to think, to plan. But today, the silence felt heavier, laced with memories he'd spent years trying to bury. Memories of fire and blood, of screams that still echoed in his dreams. The man behind the name. Isaac Cole wasn't born to be a gunslinger. Once he'd been a lawman, a deputy in a small town called Bitter Creek. It wasn't much, just a few ranches and a handful of shops, but it was home. Isaac had worn his badge with pride, enforcing a kind of justice that made life bearable in the rugged frontier. That life ended the day Eli Granger came to town. Granger and his gang had ridden into Bitter Creek like a storm. They'd robbed the bank, shot the sheriff, and set fire to half the buildings. Isaac had done what he could, fighting until his ammunition ran out, but the gang's numbers were too great. He'd been left for dead, a bullet wound in his shoulder, and his town reduced to ash. By the time Isaac recovered, Bitter Creek was gone, its survivors scattered to the wind. And so Isaac became a drifter, not out of choice but necessity. His badge was long gone, replaced by a revolver he'd learned to use with deadly efficiency. He wasn't a lawman anymore, he was a hunter, and his prey was Eli Granger. The trail to Devil's Fork. The trail that had led Isaac to Devil's Fork had been long and bloody. Over the years, he'd tracked and killed several members of the Granger gang, each death bringing him closer to his ultimate goal. Granger was smart, smarter than most outlaws. He didn't stick to one place for long, and he surrounded himself with men who were as ruthless as they were loyal. But no one could stay hidden forever, not in a world as small as the frontier. Isaac had pieced together Granger's movements one fragment at a time, whispers in saloons, scribbled notes in abandoned hideouts, dying words gasped by gang members too slow on the draw. Devil's Fork was the end of the trail, Isaac was sure of it. Granger had been spotted there more than once, and the timing matched the pattern Isaac had come to recognize. Granger wouldn't just be passing through, he'd be planning something big, something that would require time and manpower. Isaac's hand drifted to the revolver at his side, his fingers brushing the smooth grip. He'd cleaned and loaded the weapon the night before, a ritual as much as a necessity. It wasn't just a tool, it was his lifeline, the instrument of his vengeance. The message. Isaac pulled his horse to a stop near a cluster of boulders, dismounting with practiced ease. He knelt to inspect the ground, his sharp eyes scanning for signs of recent activity. A faint trail of hoofprints led toward a narrow canyon to the east, the kind of place Outlaws favored for its natural cover and defensible terrain. He didn't follow immediately. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of leather. Using the tip of his knife, he carved a simple message into its surface. "I'm coming for you, Granger." Isaac tied the strip to a nearby sagebrush where it would catch the wind and flutter like a flag. He wasn't hiding, not anymore. Granger would see the message and he'd know exactly who had left it. The element of surprise was no longer Isaac's weapon. Now he was counting on fear. Nightfall. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Isaac made camp near the mouth of the canyon. He built a small fire, its flickering light casting long shadows against the rock walls. The desert came alive at night, the air filled with the rustle of unseen creatures and the mournful cries of coyotes. Isaac sat with his back against a boulder, his revolver resting across his lap. He didn't sleep, not really. His eyes closed for brief moments, but his ears remained sharp, attuned to every sound. In his line of work, sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. Around midnight, he heard the faint echo of voices. He doused the fire and moved to the edge of the canyon, staying low as he peered into the darkness. The moonlight was faint, but it was enough to reveal a small group of riders moving through the canyon floor. Isaac's jaw tightened. Granger's men. There were 4 of them, each armed and moving with the kind of ease that came from confidence. They didn't look like they were expecting trouble, but they were cautious, their eyes scanning the shadows as they rode. Isaac watched them pass, his mind already calculating. He could take them now. 4 against 1 wasn't bad odds, especially with the element of surprise. But he knew these men weren't his target. They were messengers, scouts sent ahead to prepare for whatever Granger had planned. Killing them wouldn't end this, it would only delay the inevitable. Isaac waited until the riders disappeared into the canyon, their voices fading into the night. Then he returned to his camp, his resolve hardening. A storm on the horizon. By dawn, Isaac was on the move again, his horse picking its way carefully along the rocky path. The canyon opened up into a wide plain, its flat expanse broken by a distant line of hills. In the far distance, he could make out the faint outline of a ranch, Granger's likely destination. Isaac stopped to water his horse at a shallow stream, his thoughts racing. Granger wouldn't just be planning a raid, he'd be plotting something bigger, something that would leave an indelible mark on the territory. Isaac had seen the aftermath of Granger's schemes before, burnt-out buildings, lifeless bodies, and the haunting silence of destruction. He couldn't let it happen again. As he mounted his horse and rode toward the ranch, the wind carried a faint sound, hoofbeats in the distance, growing louder with every passing moment. Isaac's hand went to his revolver, his senses sharpening. The chase was about to begin. The morning sun burned low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert floor as Isaac Cole pressed onward. Every step of his horse's hooves sent up little puffs of dust, the rhythmic cadence blending with the soft whisper of the wind. His eyes were sharp, scanning the rocky terrain for signs of movement. He'd been following the faint trail of Granger's scouts since dawn, their hoofprints leading toward the distant hills. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Isaac wasn't the only one moving. The desert felt alive, charged with an invisible tension that rippled through the air. Somewhere out there, Eli Granger and his gang were preparing for whatever mayhem they had planned, their confidence bolstered by the weight of numbers and reputation. Isaac, however, was unshaken. He'd spent years dismantling Granger's network one man at a time, and he knew better than anyone how fragile that confidence could be when the cracks began to show. But Granger wasn't just another outlaw. He was a predator, clever and calculating, and he had eluded capture for longer than most men would have survived in the harsh frontier. Isaac had no illusions about the danger ahead. This wasn't just a hunt. It was a war of wits, patience, and will. The warning. As the morning wore on, Isaac spotted something unusual in the distance. A thin line of smoke rose against the clear blue sky, curling upward like a signal. It was too faint to be a campfire, but too deliberate to be accidental. He reined in his horse, narrowing his eyes. "A warning," he muttered under his breath. Granger's scouts had likely spotted his trail and set the smoke to alert the gang. It wasn't a challenge, it was a declaration. They knew he was coming and they weren't running. Isaac dismounted, leading his horse toward a cluster of boulders for cover. He crouched low, studying the terrain ahead. The smoke originated from a rocky outcrop near the base of the hills, a natural bottleneck that would be easy to defend. If Granger's men were waiting for him, that was where they'd be. Isaac took a deep breath, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. He'd walked into ambushes before and he'd survived them all. This time would be no different, the ambush. The outcrop was eerily quiet as Isaac approached, his footsteps muffled by the soft sand. He left his horse tethered behind a ridge, creeping forward with the practiced movements of a man who'd spent his life walking the line between hunter and hunted. The smoke had dissipated by now, but the faint scent of burning wood lingered in the air. Isaac's instincts screamed at him to stop, and he froze, his hand tightening around the grip of his revolver. There, a faint sound, the soft scrape of leather on stone. He turned sharply, his gun coming up just as a figure emerged from behind a boulder, rifle raised. The shot rang out, shattering the stillness of the desert. Isaac's revolver barked in response, the bullet finding its mark before the man could pull the trigger. The outlaw crumpled to the ground, his rifle clattering beside him. Isaac dove for cover as more gunfire erupted, bullets ricocheting off the rocks around him. Granger's men had been lying in wait, their positions scattered across the outcrop. Isaac counted at least 4 shooters, their shadows flickering against the rocks as they moved to flank him. "Cole!" one of them shouted, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "You're a damn fool for coming here alone. Granger's gonna gut you and leave you for the vultures." Isaac smirked, his revolver snapping up to take out another attacker. The man fell with a grunt, his body tumbling down the slope. "Tell Granger I'll save him the trouble," Isaac muttered. The fight was fast and brutal. Isaac moved like a phantom, his shots precise and deadly. He didn't waste ammunition, every bullet had a purpose, every movement calculated to keep him one step ahead of his enemies. By the time the last outlaw fell, the outcrop was silent once more, the echoes of the gunfight fading into the distance. A grim discovery. Isaac reloaded his revolver as he surveyed the aftermath, his boots crunching against the loose gravel. The bodies of Granger's men lay scattered among the rocks, their weapons gleaming in the sun. It wasn't the first time Isaac had left a trail of death in his wake, and it wouldn't be the last. Near the center of the outcrop, he found a crude campsite, a few bedrolls, a fire pit, and a battered saddlebag. He knelt, rifling through the bag until he found what he was looking for, a map. The map was rough, drawn on a scrap of parchment, but it was clear enough. It showed the surrounding hills with a single location marked in bold strokes, a place called Black Hollow. Isaac frowned, studying the map. He'd heard of Black Hollow before, a remote canyon known for its narrow passes and treacherous cliffs. It was the perfect place for an outlaw hideout, and if the map was accurate, it was less than half a day's ride from his current position. Granger was close, closer than Isaac had dared to hope, but the discovery brought no relief. If Granger had chosen Black Hollow as his base, it meant the final confrontation would be anything but simple. Isaac's grip tightened on the map as he rose to his feet. "This ends now," he said quietly. "The long ride." The trail to Black Hollow was unforgiving, winding through jagged ravines and across stretches of barren desert. Isaac rode hard, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of dust as he pressed onward. The sun beat down mercilessly and the heat seemed to sap the strength from the air, but Isaac was relentless. Every step brought him closer to the man he'd spent years chasing. As he approached the canyon, the terrain grew more rugged, the cliffs towering overhead like silent sentinels. The entrance to Black Hollow was narrow, flanked by walls of red rock that glowed in the fading light of the afternoon. Isaac dismounted, leading his horse to a shaded alcove where it could rest. He wouldn't be riding into the canyon. If Granger's men were waiting, they'd hear him coming a mile away. Isaac took a moment to check his weapons, his movements methodical. He'd brought extra ammunition, enough to last through a prolonged fight, but he knew it might not be enough. Granger was a survivor, and he wouldn't go down without a fight. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of voices from deeper within the canyon. Isaac's jaw tightened. The time for planning was over. It was time to finish what he'd started. The canyon walls loomed high above Isaac Cole as he stepped cautiously into the narrow entrance of Black Hollow. The towering cliffs on either side seemed to close in, their jagged edges silhouetted against the fading light. The air was still and heavy, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and the distant trace of wood smoke. Somewhere ahead, Eli Granger and his gang were waiting, confident, dangerous, and unaware that death had come to meet them. Isaac moved like a shadow, his revolver in hand and his steps deliberate. The sound of his boots on the rocky ground was barely audible, muffled by years of practice and the quiet resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. Every nerve was alert, every sense heightened as he ventured deeper into the canyon. The calm before the storm. Black Hollow wasn't just a canyon, it was a natural fortress. The narrow entrance gave way to a series of winding paths and jagged ridges, the terrain designed by nature to favor the defender. Isaac paused behind a cluster of boulders, studying the ground ahead. Tracks crisscrossed the dirt, hoofprints, boot marks, the remains of wagon wheels. This was no temporary hideout. Granger had been here for a while and his men had dug in. Isaac crouched low, scanning the walls of the canyon for movement. It was too quiet. Granger's men weren't sloppy and they wouldn't leave their leader unguarded. He spotted the faint glint of sunlight reflecting off metal, rifle barrels hidden among the rocks. "They're expecting trouble," Isaac muttered to himself. Good. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a small bundle of dynamite he'd taken from Granger's outcrop earlier. The sticks were old but serviceable, their fuses coiled like sleeping snakes. Isaac had no illusions about surviving a direct assault, but he wasn't here for a fair fight. He was here to win. The first shot. Isaac moved swiftly and silently, making his way up a rocky incline that overlooked the canyon floor. From his elevated position, he could see the heart of Black Hollow, a wide, flat area dotted with tents and wagons. A large fire burned at the center, its smoke curling lazily into the sky. Around the fire sat a dozen men, laughing and drinking, their rifles propped nearby, and there, standing apart from the others, was Eli Granger. Even from this distance, Isaac recognized him. Granger was a tall man, his presence commanding and unmistakable. The scar that ran from his temple to his jaw caught the firelight, giving him the appearance of a devil risen from the depths. He was speaking to his men, his voice carrying faintly on the wind, but Isaac couldn't make out the words. It didn't matter. The time for talking had passed. Isaac pulled the dynamite from his coat and lit the first fuse. He counted to 3 before hurling it toward the fire below. The bundle arced through the air, landing with a thud among the wagons. For a split second, there was silence. Then came the explosion. The blast shook the canyon, sending debris and flames skyward. Granger's men shouted in panic, scrambling for cover as Isaac fired his first shot. The bullet struck one of the outlaws square in the chest, sending him sprawling backward into the dirt. Isaac didn't wait for them to recover. He lit a second fuse, tossing another bundle of dynamite toward the remaining wagons. The resulting explosion engulfed the area in a cloud of smoke and fire, The chaos unfolds. Granger's men responded quickly, their shouts of alarm turning into curses as they grabbed their rifles and took aim at the ridge. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks around Isaac, sending shards of stone flying. He dropped low, returning fire with precision. Every shot counted. He took out 2 more outlaws, their bodies slumping over the smoldering remains of the wagons. Granger himself stood firm amid the chaos, barking orders as he grabbed a rifle and fired into the smoke. "Find him!" he shouted. "Flush him out. I want that bastard dead." Isaac moved, his position already compromised. He slid down the rocky slope, landing in a crouch behind a cluster of boulders closer to the camp. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and burning wood. He could hear the shouts of Granger's men as they spread out, their boots crunching against the gravel. The canyon became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Isaac darted between cover, firing and reloading in quick succession. He kept moving, never staying in one place long enough for them to pin him down. The dynamite had thrown them into disarray, and he was using their confusion to his advantage. The final confrontation. By the time the dust began to settle, only a handful of Granger's men remained. Isaac had taken out most of them, their bodies scattered across the canyon floor. But he knew the fight wasn't over. Granger wouldn't go down quietly, and Isaac wouldn't leave until the job was done. He emerged from the shadows, his revolver raised as he stepped into the open area near the fire. Granger stood waiting, his rifle in one hand and a revolver holstered at his hip. His scarred face twisted into a grin as he saw Isaac. "Well, well," Granger said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Isaac Cole. Didn't think you had it in you to come this far. I'm impressed." "Your men are dead, Granger," Isaac said, his voice cold. "It's just you and me now." Granger chuckled, his grip tightening on his rifle. "You think you're a hero, don't you? Riding in here, guns blazing like you're some kind of savior, but you're just like me, a killer." Isaac's jaw tightened. "Maybe, but I'm here to end you." The 2 men circled each other, their movements slow and deliberate. The fire crackled between them, its light casting flickering shadows across their faces. Isaac's hand hovered over his revolver, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. Granger moved first, raising his rifle with lightning speed. Isaac fired before the barrel could level, his bullet striking Granger's shoulder and sending him stumbling backward. Granger dropped the rifle, his hand going to his revolver as he drew and fired in one smooth motion. The bullet grazed Isaac's side, but he didn't falter. He fired again, his shot hitting Granger square in the chest. Granger staggered, his revolver slipping from his grasp as he fell to his knees. Blood seeped through his shirt, staining the dirt beneath him. He looked up at Isaac, his face contorted with pain and fury. "You think this changes anything?" Granger rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Men like me, we don't die. Someone else will take my place." Isaac leveled his revolver, his expression unreadable. "Then I'll deal with them when the time comes." He fired one last shot, ending it. The canyon was silent as Isaac holstered his revolver, the echoes of the gunfight fading into the distance. He stood over Granger's lifeless body for a moment, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to subside. It was over. Years of hunting, of chasing shadows and memories had led to this moment. Isaac didn't linger. He gathered his supplies and mounted his horse, the animal snorting softly as if sensing the tension. As he rode out of Black Hollow, the rising sun painted the canyon walls in hues of gold and crimson. The desert felt different now, lighter somehow, as if it too had been waiting for this reckoning. Isaac Cole had spent years running from his past, but now he rode toward the horizon, his burden eased and his purpose fulfilled. Black Hollow was behind him, and the frontier stretched endlessly ahead, a place where a man could start again if he was brave enough to try. The sun broke over the horizon, spilling golden light across the desert floor and casting long shadows over the jagged cliffs of Black Hollow. Isaac Cole rode slowly, his black horse moving with a weary but steady gait. The trail was quieter now, the echoes of gunfire and death fading with the night. The weight of his revolver on his hip felt heavier than usual, though it wasn't the weapon itself but what it represented, the end of the hunt. Eli Granger was dead. The man who had haunted Isaac's dreams, who had left his town in ruins and his soul scarred, was gone. The final shot still echoed in Isaac's mind, a sound that should have brought relief but left only silence in its wake. The scars of survival. Isaac guided his horse toward a shaded outcrop and dismounted. His body ached from the long night, and the graze on his side stung with every movement. He pulled a canteen from his saddlebag and took a long drink before pouring some over the wound to clean it. The pain was sharp, but he didn't flinch. Pain was an old companion, one he'd learned to live with. As he sat beneath the shade, his eyes drifted to the horizon. For years, his life had been consumed by the hunt for Granger. Every step, every bullet, every choice had been aimed at this single goal. Now that it was done, the question he'd avoided for so long loomed large in his mind. What now? The faces of the people he'd lost, the sheriff, his neighbors, his friends, flickered in his memory like ghosts. Bitter Creek was long gone, and with it, the man he used to be. Revenge had filled the void, but now that it was gone, he felt the hollowness return, deeper and more insistent than before. Isaac closed his eyes, letting the desert wind wash over him. The wilderness had always been his sanctuary, a place where the noise of the world faded and the truth became clearer. But today, even the wind carried questions he couldn't answer. A stranger's thanks. Isaac's solitude was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. His hand went to his revolver instinctively, but he relaxed when he saw the rider, a wiry man in a dusty coat, his face streaked with grime and his hat askew. Behind him trailed a small wagon carrying what appeared to be supplies. The man slowed as he approached, raising a hand in greeting. "Mornin'," he said, his voice hoarse. "Didn't expect to see anyone out this way." Isaac nodded but said nothing, his eyes scanning the man for signs of trouble. The rider dismounted, pulling a water skin from his saddle. "Name's Clyde Harper," he said, offering a cautious smile. "I run supplies between the ranches out here. Heard some ruckus last night. Was that you?" Isaac's expression didn't change. "Could be." Clyde studied him for a moment, his smile fading. "Folks been talking about Black Hollow for years. Said it was Granger's hideout. You handle that." Yet Isaac didn't answer directly, but the look in his eyes was enough. Clyde let out a low whistle, his respect clear. "Well, damn. If that's true, you've done this territory a hell of a favor. Granger and his gang were a plague." Isaac shrugged, brushing off the praise. "Just did what needed doing?" Clyde nodded, his tone softening. "Well, don't let anyone tell you it didn't matter. There's ranchers out here who'll sleep easier tonight because of you. Reckon that's worth something." Isaac met Clyde's gaze, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe." A stop in Devil's Fork. Isaac rode into Devil's Fork later that afternoon, the town appearing like a mirage on the horizon. The sight of the weathered buildings and dusty streets brought a pang of familiarity. Another frontier town, another place filled with people trying to carve out a life in an unforgiving land. The saloon was livelier than it had been when he arrived days earlier. Word of Granger's death had spread fast, and the mood was one of cautious celebration. Men raised glasses to toast the end of the Outlaws' reign, and women whispered to one another about the mysterious gunslinger who had brought it about. Isaac pushed through the swinging doors, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The room fell silent as heads turned to watch him. He walked to the bar, his movements slow and deliberate, and set his hat on the counter. The bartender, the same wiry man who had served him days before, gave a knowing nod. "Whiskey?" Isaac nodded. The bartender poured the drink, sliding it across the counter. "You made a mess of things out there, Cole." Isaac took a sip, savoring the burn of the liquor. Figured it needed cleaning. The bartender chuckled softly, his eyes glinting with approval. Granger's been a thorn in this territory for years. Folks will remember what you did. I'm not looking to be remembered, Isaac said, his tone flat. Maybe not, the bartender replied, but some things stick whether you want them to or not. The road ahead. Isaac left the saloon as the sun began to set, its golden light casting long shadows across the town. The weight of the past few days, and the years that had led to them, pressed heavily on his shoulders. But as he mounted his horse and turned toward the horizon, he felt a faint flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The desert stretched out before him, vast and empty, but it no longer felt like a void. It was a place of possibilities, of new beginnings waiting to be carved from the wilderness. Isaac didn't know where the road would take him, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to find out. He rode slowly, the rhythm of his horse's hooves blending with the quiet hum of the desert. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and promise, and the horizon seemed to beckon him forward. Eli Granger was gone, and with him the ghost that had haunted Isaac's every step. The journey wasn't over, but it was no longer a path of vengeance. It was a path of redemption, of rebuilding a life from the ashes of the past. And so, as the last light of day faded and the stars began to appear, Isaac Cole rode into the unknown, leaving behind the blood-soaked trails of his past and forging a future one step at a time.